The story begins with Rich Gallagher setting off on what should have been a routine delivery. He's driving through the desolate and unforgiving terrain of Nevada, a stretch of highway that cuts through barren desert and rugged mountains. The road is isolated, with miles of nothingness on either side, the kind of place where cell phone signals drop and towns are few and far between. Rich is comfortable in the solitude of the road, the hum of the engine, and the open landscape a familiar companion. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the desert as he follows the route he's driven many times before. The delivery is straightforward. He's transporting goods to a small town on the other side of the state, a trip he's made several times without incident. As night falls, the road grows darker, the sky above a deep, starless black. The only light comes from the truck's headlights, which barely penetrate the inky darkness. Rich isn't worried. He's used to driving at night, and the isolation doesn't bother him. But as he continues down the desolate highway, a strange sense of unease begins to creep in. The road ahead stretches out like a ribbon of asphalt into the void, with no signs of life or landmarks to break the monotony. The airwaves are silent, the radio picking up nothing but static. The silence inside the cab becomes oppressive, and Rich finds himself glancing at the rearview mirrors more often than usual, as if expecting to see something out of place. Suddenly, Rich notices something strange in the distance, a faint, flickering light on the horizon, far off the road. It's not the lights of a town or another vehicle, but something else, something that doesn't belong in the vast emptiness of the desert. Curiosity gets the better of him, and Rich decides to investigate, veering off the main road onto a narrow, unmarked path that leads toward the light. As Rich drives closer to the light, the landscape around him begins to change. The desert, once flat and predictable, now seems to shift and warp under the cover of darkness. The road he's following is uneven, barely more than a dirt track, and the truck lurches over the rough terrain. The light ahead pulses intermittently, as if beckoning him forward, but as he approaches, it suddenly disappears, leaving him in total darkness. Rich stops the truck, the engine idling as he tries to get his bearings. The sense of unease grows stronger, an almost physical presence pressing down on him. He checks his GPS, but the device has lost signal, displaying only a blank screen. The headlights reveal nothing but an empty expanse of desert, the light that drew him here gone as if it never existed. Just as Rich is about to turn back, he hears something, a low, rumbling sound that seems to come from deep within the earth. The ground beneath the truck vibrates slightly, and the air is thick with an unnatural stillness. Then, in the distance, he sees it, a figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by the headlights. It's a man, but there's something off about him, something that makes Rich's blood run cold. The figure begins to walk towards the truck, its movements slow and deliberate. Rich's instincts scream at him to leave, but he's frozen, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the figure draws closer. Just as the figure reaches the edge of the headlight's beam, it disappears, vanishing into the darkness as if it was never there. Shaken, Rich decides he's had enough and starts to turn the truck around, but the path behind him has changed. The road he drove in on is gone, replaced by a maze of tracks that seem to lead in every direction and none. Panic sets in as he realizes he's lost. The familiar road and the safety of civilization seemingly cut off from him. The truck's engine sputters and stalls, leaving Rich stranded in the middle of the desert with no way to call for help. The darkness presses in from all sides, and the air grows colder, the temperature dropping unnaturally fast. He's trapped in a place that doesn't feel real, a landscape that seems to shift and change around him, as if the desert itself is alive and intent on swallowing him whole. As the night wears on, Rich begins to experience terrifying visions, shadowy figures moving just beyond the reach of the headlights, strange symbols etched into the desert floor, and whispers that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sense of isolation is overwhelming, and Rich feels the boundaries of reality starting to blur. The truck's radio crackles to life, but instead of the usual stations, it's filled with distorted voices and eerie sounds that make no sense. He hears the faint, ghostly echoes of other truckers, their voices filled with fear and despair, calling out for help that will never come. It's as if the road has become a trap, a place where those who enter are doomed to disappear without a trace. Desperate to escape, Rich tries to restart the truck, but the engine remains dead. He steps out of the cab, the cold desert air biting at his skin, and begins to walk, hoping to find the main road or some sign of life. But the landscape around him is a twisted, nightmarish version of the desert he thought he knew. Endless dunes that seem to stretch on forever, broken only by jagged rocks and the occasional flicker of distant, ghostly lights. As Rich stumbles through the darkness, he feels the presence of something watching him, something malevolent and ancient. The air grows thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and he begins to hear the sound of footsteps behind him, growing closer with every step. He turns, but there's nothing there, only the endless, empty desert. The visions intensify, and Rich realizes that he's not the first to be trapped here. He sees fleeting glimpses of other truckers, their faces twisted in fear, their rigs abandoned and rusting in the sand. The road has claimed them, just as it's claiming him, and there's no way out. As the first light of dawn begins to break over the horizon, the desert around Rich seems to shift and shimmer, the nightmare landscape fading into the familiar terrain of the Nevada desert. The main road reappears in the distance, and Rich, exhausted and desperate, stumbles back to his truck. Miraculously, the engine starts, and Rich drives back onto the main road, his mind racing with the horrors he's just experienced. The sun rises higher, casting long shadows across the desert, but the sense of unease remains. He glances in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the twisted landscape he escaped from, but the road behind him is empty. Rich continues his journey, but he knows something has changed. The road feels different now, less familiar, and the sense of safety he once took for granted is gone. He reaches his destination, delivers his load, and returns home. But the memory of that night stays with him, haunting his every thought. The story ends with investigators combing through the last known location of Rich's truck, now abandoned and empty in the middle of the Nevada desert. His disappearance adds to the growing list of unsolved cases along this stretch of road, a mystery that deepens with each new driver who vanishes without a trace. As the investigators piece together the clues, they begin to uncover the chilling history of the road, a place where time and reality bend, where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur, and where those who stray too far off the beaten path are lost forever.